There is nothing better than proving those who doubted you wrong. Maya Pruitt was only 16 when she set out to do just that. Every Saturday morning, she collected heavy rusted steel pipes that neighboring farmers had discarded as useless waste. She knocked on doors and asked politely, while the men chuckled from their porch rails under the thick, dusty Kentucky heat. Maya had a single, quiet purpose, and absolutely nobody in Callaway County knew what she was planning. If you love heartwarming stories about family resilience and determination, subscribe to watch our videos every week, and please let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Have a great day. By the middle of July, the sky over Callaway County turned the color of old beaten brass. The air itself felt heavy, smelling of scorched soil, dry clay, and hot diesel exhaust from empty tractors. This was Kentucky. The heat wave was relentless, peaking at 98 degrees Fahrenheit for 12 days straight. On the hill at Rollin Hills Farm, Harlan Pruitt stood in his 15-acre soybean field. He was a quiet man, his face lined with years of hard labor, his hands calloused from decades of working this river-bottom land. Right now he was staring down at the cracked earth. The soil was so dry it had split into deep, dark crevices, matching the lines of worry on Harlan's forehead. His crop was dying. The soybean leaves were curling up, turning a pale, stressed yellow under the unforgiving sun. Harlan knew every inch of this dirt. His grandfather had cleared the oak roots to plant the first crops after the Second World War. But he had never seen a drought like this. The creek bed was nothing but a dry trail of gray pebbles, and the groundwater table had receded deep into the limestone layers beneath the county. Maya Pruitt, his 16-year-old daughter, stood beside him. She wore her usual outfit, a pair of faded denim overalls, the straps dusty with dried clay, and a baseball cap covering her dark braids. Maya didn't look at the sky. She looked at the ground. She knelt, pressing her palm against the burning clay. It felt like an oven. Underneath this hill sat their family's spring-fed pond. It was small, but it never went dry. The water was there. The problem was getting it up here 9 feet higher to this parched hill. Harlan's conventional electric pump had burned out 3 days ago. To buy a new commercial pump and 1,200 feet of heavy-duty PVC pipe would cost at least $1,200. Every farm supply store in Murray had already sold out of pumps, and those that remained were marked up beyond reach. The bank didn't care about the heat. They only cared about their $8,500 loan payment, which was due in exactly 45 days. The loan officer, a cold man named Miller, who sat in an air-conditioned brick office in town, had already called twice. He didn't ask about the weather. He only reminded Harlan of the foreclosure terms. If the soybeans failed, Rollin Hills Farm would belong to the county, and the Pruitt family would have to pack their bags. Maya looked up at her father. "Dad," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "We don't need a pump. We just need pipes. The pond is low, but the natural draw on the north ridge sits 9 feet above this hill. If we capture the runoff there, gravity will push the water down, drip by drip, right to the roots." She had spent the last 2 evenings drawing rough schematics on the backs of old feed bags, calculating the slope, using an old carpenter's level and a ball of twine. Her older brother Cass laughed from the back of the flatbed truck. He was 19 and he had no interest in farming. Gravity, Cass sneered, taking a sip from a sweating soda can. "You're a kid, Maya. You think you're an engineer now. You can't run a line over 200 yards without a motorized pump. You're dreaming. We're broke and Dad's soybeans are going to fry. We should just let the bank take the place and move to Louisville." Harlan didn't laugh. He looked at the north ridge, then at his daughter's dirt-streaked face. He slowly shook his head. "Maya, we don't have the money for PVC. The farm store won't give us credit, and I can't borrow another dollar from the cooperative." But Maya wasn't thinking about buying new things. She knew that Gravity didn't charge for diesel, and it didn't ask for a credit card. She just needed a way to guide the water. That evening, Maya walked into the small back room of the farmhouse. The room smelled of old paper and dried chamomile tea. Her grandmother Opal sat in her wooden wheelchair by the window, her silver hair catching the fading light. Opal was 81 years old. For 30 years, she had worked as the county agricultural librarian, and she had kept every old pamphlet and manual from the 1960s. She knew the history of every family in the county, and she remembered when the hills were irrigated by hand before the big agricultural corporations bought up the bottomlands. "You have that look in your eyes, child," Opal said, her voice soft but sharp. She reached into her oak desk and pulled out a thick, yellowed manual from 1968. The cover was worn, titled Principles of Gravity Hydraulics for Smallholder Farms. This was written by an old university extension agent, back when farmers didn't rely on computers to tell them how to grow food. It has the math you need. Maya took the book. Her fingers traced the faded diagrams. Brody Vance laughed at me today, Grandma. He said, "We're done." He said a black girl from a 40-acre farm doesn't know how to run a water line. Opal smiled, a slow, patient smile. She reached out and patted Maya's dusty hand. Nothing is truly worthless, Maya, when it is placed in the hands of patience. Remember that. The land doesn't listen to Brody's laughter. It only listens to the water. The Vances have plenty of machines, but they don't have the patience of this soil. The next morning, Maya began her search. She took a wooden wheelbarrow built by her father years ago and pushed it down the dusty county road toward the boundary line of Vance Agri, the massive corporate farm owned by Silas Vance. Silas was a wealthy man who owned 2,000 acres, 3 combine harvesters, and a fleet of red pickup trucks. At the edge of his property sat a massive scrap pile. Old machinery, broken tractor parts, and hundreds of discarded steel pipes from their old irrigation system lay rusting in the tall grass. These were heavy galvanized pipes discarded when Silas switched to lightweight aluminum and automated pivot systems 10 years ago. Brody Vance, Silas's 24-year-old son, was leaning against a shiny red truck holding a clipboard. He watched Maya push her creaking wooden wheelbarrow toward the scrap pile. "Hey, Pruitt," Brody called out, laughing. "What are you doing? Collecting scrap to pay off your dad's mortgage? That pile is trash. You're wasting your time. Even the scrap yard in town won't give you $10 for those old heavy pipes." Maya didn't answer. She kept her head down. She reached into the grass and grabbed a 10-foot section of old galvanized steel pipe. It was heavy, the metal rough with rust and dirt. She dragged it out, her muscles straining, her arms trembling under the heat. The pipe was hot to the touch, and her hands were quickly stained with red rust. Her boots slipped on the dry weeds, but she refused to look up. Brody walked over his boots, kicking up dust. "Seriously, Maya, you think you can use that junk? Those pipes are rusted out, the threads are stripped, and they're full of scale. You're just a kid playing in the dirt. Go back home and help your dad pack." Maya wiped the sweat from her forehead with her sleeve, leaving a dark smudge of grease on her cheek. She looked Brody in the eye. "Your dad threw them away. That means they're mine if I ask." "Take them," Brody sneered, spitting on the dry clay. "Take all the garbage you want. You look like a beggar with that wooden cart. It's not going to save your farm. In 40 days, my dad will buy your land at the county auction anyway." Maya didn't say a word. She lifted the heavy steel pipe, placing it carefully on the wooden wheelbarrow. Her hands were raw, her palms stinging from the rough metal, but she didn't show the pain. She pushed the heavy cart back down the road, the wooden wheel creaking under the weight, while Brody's laughter echoed behind her from the fence line. As she reached the Roland Hills gate, she stood in the dust, catching her breath. Absolutely nobody in the county believed in her. But she had the first 10 pipes, and she had Opal's book. On Monday morning, the situation took a sharp turn for the worse. The faint trickling sound of the shared creek at the edge of the Pruitt property suddenly vanished. Maya ran to the boundary line, her boots sinking slightly into the dry silt. Silas Vance was standing on the wooden access bridge. He was wearing an expensive red button-down shirt and polished alligator boots. He held a heavy iron lock and a rusted chain, wrapping them tightly around the main wheel valve that fed the creek branch leading into Harlan's lower field. The creek branch had watered the Pruitt family's lower acres for 3 generations, a vital artery that had never been disputed. The steel chain clanked. It was a loud, heavy sound that seemed to echo through the dry trees. "Mr. Vance," Maya called out, stepping onto the bridge. "You're locking the valve. Our lower field needs that runoff. We have a shared water agreement signed by your grandfather." Silas didn't look up immediately. He slowly clicked the padlock shut, then turned his face indifferent under his wide-brimmed hat. "Shared runoff is for active farms, girl. Your dad's pump is dead. You're letting the water sit in the ditch and evaporate. I have 3,000 acres of corn that need every gallon. If your dad wants water, tell him to buy a working pump. Agreements from 50 years ago don't keep my crops alive today." "You know we can't afford that right now," Maya said, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "You're taking what belongs to the valley." Silas stepped off the bridge, his alligator boots crunching on the dry gravel. That's not my problem. Farming isn't a charity. If you can't irrigate, you don't belong in this valley. The law protects those who can use the water, not those who let it sink into the mud. But what Silas Vance didn't know was that Maya wasn't planning on letting the water evaporate. She had already mapped the contours of the northern ridge. The natural catchment basin on the hill belonged to the Pruitts. If she could dig a trench from that basin, she wouldn't need a single drop of Silas's shared creek. By 2 p.m., the heat reached its peak. The air was a thick, shimmering blanket of dust. Maya stood on the north ridge, holding an old iron shovel with a cracked ash handle. The hill was steep, covered in tough brambles and dry, hard clay that had been baked by the sun for weeks. She started to dig. Each strike of the shovel against the earth felt like hitting concrete. Sparks flew when the metal hit buried flint stones. Her shoulders ached after just 10 minutes. The hot sun beat down on her neck, and sweat stung her eyes. She worked alone. She dug a trench 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep, slowly carving a path down the slope toward the soybean field. The clay was thick with old oak roots that had to be chopped away inch by inch with a hand axe. By 8 p.m., the sun finally slipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple. Maya's hands were covered in blisters, and her lower back felt like it was on fire. She sat on the dirt bank, her legs dangling in the shallow trench she had dug. She had completed only 40 yards. She had 160 yards left to go. Her brother Cass had already left for the town tavern in his old truck, his headlights cutting through the dust. The silence of the hill was heavy, broken only by the dry wind rustling the dead leaves. Maya closed eyes, fighting the urge to cry. Her throat was dry, tasting of clay and salt. She felt completely isolated. Then she heard the soft, rhythmic sound of metal striking earth. Thump, creak, thump. She opened her eyes and looked down the hill. Through the dim moonlight, she saw a figure. Harlan Pruitt was swinging a heavy pickaxe. He just wore his faded work shirt, his shoulders hunched, his arms rising and falling with a steady, quiet rhythm. Beside him sat the old wooden wheelbarrow carrying an extra shovel and a large plastic jug of well water. He didn't ask questions. He just saw the dirt path his daughter had started. Maya slid down the dirt bank. She grabbed her shovel and walked to the next section. Father and daughter worked in absolute silence for 3 hours. The only sounds were their breathing, the scrape of iron on clay, and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. The cool night air brought a brief relief, but their muscles were screaming with exhaustion. By midnight, the trench stretched 150 yards down the hill. The path was cleared. "Get some sleep," Maya Harlan said, his voice raspy as he leaned on his spade. His chest rose and fell heavily, his shirt soaked with sweat. "We'll start hauling the pipes tomorrow. We've got the path. Now we just need the metal." But the next morning brought a different kind of obstacle. Maya was pushing the wooden wheelbarrow loaded with 4 heavy steel pipes near the main crossroads of Route 12. The iron wheel of the cart squeaked loudly with every turn. Suddenly, the roar of a massive diesel engine shattered the morning quiet. A green John Deere 8R tractor pulling a 24-row planter rumbled around the corner. Brody Vance was in the air-conditioned cab, wearing sunglasses and a smirk. Instead of slowing down on the narrow gravel road, Brody accelerated the massive tires, kicking up a cloud of gray dust. He swung the tractor wide, blocking the intersection. The metal frame of the planter brushed against the side of Maya's wheelbarrow. The sudden jar knocked the cart over. The heavy steel pipes slid out, clattering loudly against the gravel. Brody stopped the tractor, opened the cab door, and leaned over the railing, looking down at Maya. "Still playing junk collector, Maya, look at you. Pushing a wooden toy cart, picking up scrap metal that we threw in the weeds. That wheelbarrow belongs in a museum, not on a real farm." Maya stood in the dust cloud, coughing. Her eyes burned from the diesel smoke and road dust. She looked at her overturned cart. One of the wooden handles had cracked a long white splinter, showing near the bolt. "This junk is going to water our crops, Brody," she said, her voice tight. Brody laughed, a loud grating sound over the idle of the engine. "Water. With that, if you can get water to flow uphill through those rusted pipes and make that dry dirt green, I'll get down on my knees right here on the gravel and apologize to your whole family. But you won't. You're just wasting your time before the bank takes your land. My dad's already got the survey maps ready." He slammed the cab door, engaged the transmission, and sped off. The exhaust pipes spewed a thick column of black smoke directly into Maya's face. Maya stood in the middle of the road, surrounded by the black soot. She counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3. She knelt in the dust, her fingers touching the cracked wooden handle of her father's wheelbarrow. She picked up. By the following Saturday, Maya had hauled 20 rusted pipes up to the ridge. Her arms were covered in faint pale scratches, and her hands were permanently stained with the red, dry dust of iron oxide. Harlan helped her align the first section along the trench. She used a roll of plumber's Teflon tape, wrapping it tightly around the worn, gritty threads of the connections. Then tightened them with a heavy pipe wrench. The tool was old and heavy, slipping on the rusted metal and bruising her knuckles. When the last pipe was laid, she walked back up to the catchment basin and turned the old brass valve. Her chest tightened. This was the culmination of a week of bone-breaking labor. The pipe groaned. A deep, hollow rattle vibrated through the metal under the earth. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then a sudden violent hiss erupted from the center of the line. The pressure from the 9-foot elevation drop was far stronger than Maya had expected. Before she could walk down the hill, the connection at the 5th joint ruptured. The rusted thread sheared completely off. A thick column of brown, muddy water shot 10 feet into the air, showering the dry soybeans and washing away the precious topsoil in a muddy torrent. The pressure was simply too great for the worn-out iron threads, which had been weakened by decades of exposure. "Lock the valve," Harlan shouted from the bottom of the slope. Maya scrambled back to the basin, her boots slipping on the wet clay. She turned the brass wheel, her hands raw and burning, until the water finally stopped. She stood in the wet mud, her chest heaving. The failure had cost them 15% of their stored catchment water they could not afford to lose. The mud was already drying into a hard gray crust over the drowned soybean roots, choking them off from the air. But plumber's tape was never meant to hold back the raw force of gravity. Maya sat on a rock, looking at the water pooling at the bottom of the hill, while the top remained bone dry. Maya didn't give up. The next morning, under a white, blazing sky, she opened the valve again, this time with reinforced joints that she had wrapped in wire. The water flowed down the ridge, but she quickly ran into a different law of physics. The water rushed down the steep slope, gaining speed as it traveled. At the bottom of the hill, the pressure was immense, creating a miniature swamp. The lower rows of soybeans were completely flooded, their roots sitting in a stagnant, muddy soup that smelled of rot. But on the upper slope, where the gradient was gentler, the pipes were dry. The water simply rushed past the openings too fast to seep out, or the pressure blew the connections apart. The plants there remained withered, their leaves crackling like dry paper in the wind. The gravity line was completely unbalanced, a useless contraption that threatened to kill the crop faster than the drought. Maya stood in the middle of the field, the mud caking on her boots, weighing them down. She had only 20 days left before the bank's deadline. If she couldn't balance the line, half the field would drown while the other half burned. The mortgage payment felt like a mountain she couldn't climb. She sat down in the mud, her head resting on her knees. Her shoulders shook slightly, her throat dry and tight. The sheer weight of the failure felt crushing. She reached down, her fingers touching her raw, rust-stained palms. The skin was peeling, showing red underneath, and her muscles throbbed with a dull, constant ache. Opal's voice echoed in her mind. "Nothing is truly worthless, Maya, when it is placed in the hands of patience." Maya stood up. She wiped her muddy face, leaving a streak of gray clay across her forehead. She walked back to the house, her boots clumping heavily on the wooden porch. In the back room, Opal was waiting, her glasses resting on the bridge of her nose. She pointed a thin, wrinkled finger at a page in the yellowed manual from 1968. In the margin, a handwritten note in faded blue ink read, "To balance a gravity line on a slope, use a step diameter. Large pipe at the head to reduce friction loss. Small pipe at the tail to maintain head pressure." It was a simple rule of hydraulics, known to old-time farmers but forgotten in the age of computerized pumps. "We don't have large pipes, Grandma," Maya said, her voice barely a whisper. "We only have the small ones," Silas threw away. "I can't buy 3-inch pipes." "Wendell Coe has them," Opal said, turning her head toward the window. "He's got 24 irrigation mains sitting behind his old workshop. He retired 5 years ago, but he never throws anything away. He was a friend of your grandfather's, Maya. He knows what it's like to fight this valley." The workshop of Wendell Coe was 3 miles down Route 12. Maya loaded her wooden wheelbarrow with the small steel pipes she had collected but couldn't use. The cracked handle of the cart groaned with every step, and she had to use a piece of rope to bind the wood together. The road was a long, straight stretch of sun-bleached asphalt, the heat rising in wavy lines from the black surface. Her shoulders were raw, where the overall straps rubbed against her skin, and her feet burned inside her heavy leather boots, but she didn't stop. Every step was a step towards saving Rollin Hills. When she finally pushed the squeaking cart into Wendell's dirt yard, she was drenched in sweat. A tall, black man with iron-gray hair and oil-stained jeans was standing under the shade of a tin roof, sharpening a chainsaw blade. He stopped the grinder and looked at the girl, his eyes taking in the wooden cart, the cracked handle, and the rusted pipes. Wendell Coe didn't say a word. He just stared at the wooden cart, then at Maya's dust-covered face and her raw, rust-stained hands. He knew the Pruitts were in trouble. Everyone in the county did. Wendell set the chainsaw guide down, the smell of warm oil and ground metal hanging heavy between them. He walked over to the wooden cart, his boots chewing the dry grass. He picked up one of the small steel pipes Maya had brought. He looked at the threads, then ran his calloused thumb over the jagged edge where the rust had eaten away the metal. "You're Harlan's girl," Wendell said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low, gravelly, and slow. "Yes, sir," Maya said, wiping a fresh line of sweat from her jaw. "I'm Maya. I need bigger pipes. The manual says we need a stepped diameter. 3-inch pipes for the first 100 yards, then we transition to the small ones. We have too much head pressure coming off the ridge." Wendell slowly put the pipe down. He looked at her. He didn't chuckle like Brody, and he didn't look annoyed like Silas. He just walked to the back of his shop near a pile of overgrown weeds and pulled back a green tarpaulin. Beneath it sat 20 heavy galvanized steel pipes 3 inches in diameter. "These are old mains," Wendell said, gesturing to the pile. "They've been sitting here since 1980. The metal is thick, but the threads are filled with scale and rust. If you want to trade, you're going to have to prep them yourself. I don't have the time to clean them for you." "I'll do it," Maya said immediately. Wendell walked back into his shop and emerged with a heavy iron die tool and a tin of dark thread-cutting oil. He set them on a wooden bench. "This is a hand threader. You apply the cutting oil, align the die, and turn the handles. It takes force. It takes a lot of force." Maya didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy steel tool. Under Wendell's silent watch, she set the first 3-inch pipe in the bench vise. She smeared the thick black cutting grease over the rusted threads, aligned the heavy iron die, and pushed. The first turn was incredibly hard. The tool didn't want to bite into the old metal. Maya's boots slipped on the dirt floor of the workshop. She leaned her entire body weight against the handles, her chest straining, her teeth gritted. The metal groaned, a high metallic shriek, as the steel teeth of the tool cut through the rust. The oil smoked slightly from the friction, filling the air with a sharp chemical scent. "Turn. Back off half a turn." It was a slow, exhausting rhythm. After 3 pipes, Maya's palms were covered in raw blisters that broke the salty sweat, stinging the open skin. Her face was smeared with black grease and gray road dust. Her arms felt like lead, but she didn't stop. She didn't ask for help. She worked through the heat of the afternoon. The steady scraping sound of the metal die cutting new threads echoing under the tin roof. Her grandfather had worked this way, and she felt a quiet connection to that past. Wendell stood by his workbench, sharpening a chisel. He didn't offer a hand, but he watched her out of the corner of his eye, noting the steady rhythm of her shoulders. By 5 p.m., the sun began to cast long gold shadows across the yard. Maya had completed all 12 pipes. She stood by the bench, her chest rising and falling heavily, her hands shaking slightly. She had wiped the threads clean. They were shiny, silver, and sharp. The ground around her was littered with curly gray metal shavings and black grease. Wendell walked over. He inspected the clean threads, running his thumb over the new metal. He nodded once. "Clean work. You've got patience, girl. I haven't seen a kid work like that since 1980. Load them up. You don't owe me a dime. Your grandfather would be proud." "Thank you, Mr. Coe," Maya said, her voice raspy. "Take the die tool with you," Wendell added, tossing the tin of oil onto the cart. "You'll need it to seal the final connections. Just bring it back when you're done. A tool is meant to be used, not sit in a box." Maya pushed the wooden cart back to Rollin Hills. The cart was much heavier now, the wide steel pipes rattling loudly, but her heart was steady. She felt a surge of hope. She had the right tools now. The next morning, father and daughter laid the new lines. The 3-inch pipes were installed at the head of the ridge, acting as a natural pressure reducer by allowing a larger volume of water to sit at the top without increasing the velocity too quickly. At the junction, Maya installed a simple manual flow control valve she had built using a brass gate valve and a copper reducer. Harlan held the pipes steady while she tightened the joints, their combined strength sealing the line. For the drip lines, Maya had used a hammer and a tiny nail to punch micro-holes every 18 inches along the smaller steel pipes. To prevent the water from shooting out in violent jets, she had inserted tight plugs made of rolled wool yarn from Opal's knitting basket into each hole. The wool would act as a natural restrictor, allowing the water to seep out slowly rather than spray. It was a tedious process, inserting each piece of yarn by hand, but she worked with a quiet focus. Harlan stood by the junction, his hand resting on the valve lever. "Are you ready, Maya?" Maya stood on the slope, her eyes fixed on the soybean field. The crop looked fragile, the yellowing leaves drooping in the midday heat. This was the moment. "Open it, Dad," she said. Harlan slowly turned the brass wheel. The heavy pipe groaned. Maya knelt in the middle of the row, her heart counting the seconds. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds total. A faint, soft, gurgling sound echoed through the metal. Then, at the first joint, the 3-inch pipe sweated. The threads held. There was no rupture. Maya watched the line trace down the hill. One by one, the wool plugs began to darken. A tiny clear drop of water formed on the first plug. It hung for a second, catching the bright sunlight, then fell onto the dry soil. Plop, then another. Plop, plop. Along all 15 acres, the pipes began to drip. The water didn't spray. It didn't wash away the soil. It seeped slowly directly into the earth, forming dark, damp circles around the base of every soybean plant. The gravity line was perfectly balanced. Harlan walked down the row, his eyes wide. He knelt and touched the wet clay. He looked up at his daughter, his eyes shining. "Maya, it's working. Drip by drip. We have a chance now." Maya collapsed onto the dirt bank, the old manual resting on her lap. Her hands were raw, covered in bandages, but she felt a deep, quiet peace. Over the next 2 weeks, the weather remained dry, but Rollin Hill's farm was changing. While the rest of Callaway County began to fade into a dusty, dry yellow, the Pruitt crop did something remarkable. The soybean leaves began to uncurl. They turned a deep, rich, healthy green. The stems grew thick and sturdy, reaching toward the sky. Maya's gravity line worked day and night, silent and steady, using only the simple, free power of the hill. By the first week of August, the drought in Callaway County reached a critical point. The temperature hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and even the weeds along the highways were turning gray, crumbling to dust under the tires of passing trucks. Vance Agri was in trouble. Silas Vance's deep well system was struggling, the water table dropping too fast for his shallow intake valves. And his 3 massive pivot irrigators were running day and night, throwing a fine mist that evaporated before it even touched the dry earth. Silas had spent $5,000 on a heavy-duty electric pump to pull water from the deepest aquifer under his land to save his 300 acres of prize corn. On a Tuesday afternoon, a loud metallic screech echoed from the pump house at Vance Agri, a sound like tearing steel. The sound was followed by a thick column of greasy black smoke rising from the ventilation fan. Brody Vance stood in the pump house, shouting over the din. He hit the main control panel with his clipboard, but the dials remained at 0, the warning lights flashing red. The pump motor, running continuously for 48 hours under extreme load in the baking heat, had overheated. The main capacitor had exploded, melting the internal copper wiring into a useless lump of slag. The pump was dead, ruined beyond repair, a monument to their reliance on expensive machinery. Silas Vance walked into the pump house, his face gray and lined with sudden age. "What happened?" he demanded, looking at the smoke. "The motor fried," Dad Brody muttered, his face covered in soot. "We ran it too hard. The water table was too low. The repair guy from the town store says it'll take 2 weeks and $1,500 just to ship the replacement parts from Lexington. Our corn won't survive 3 days in this heat. It's already drying out." Silas walked out of the building. He looked across the dry valley. His cornfields were already drooping, the stalks dry and paper-thin, representing a potential $40,000 loss that would hurt even his massive operation. Then he turned his head and looked at the hill. The contrast was stark. On the Pruitt side of the boundary line, the 15-acre field of soybeans was green, lush, and thick. The leaves were wide, catching the wind and showing a healthy silver undersheath. From the ridge, the silent gravity system was still dripping, sending cool well water directly to the roots without using a single watt of electricity or a drop of diesel. The simple gravity line made from his scrap metal was keeping the Pruitts alive while his $5,000 system burned. 3 days later, Clifton Barr, the county agricultural extension agent, arrived at Rollin Hills. He had brought 2 agriculture students from Murray State University and a local reporter. Clifton carried a digital flow meter and a water pressure gauge, eager to see the physics of the system in action. Clifton walked the rows, inspecting the wool plugs. The reporter's camera shutter clicked repeatedly, capturing the dark, damp soil surrounding the green plants. One of the students took notes, measuring the steady, rhythmic drip rate. "Harlan, this is incredible," Clifton said, shaking his head in disbelief as he read the digital display. "We've been measuring water usage across the county. Your daughter's gravity system is using 60% less water than Silas's pivot irrigators, and you have 0 fuel costs. This is the most efficient drip line in the state. You've solved the pressure drop problem using a step diameter." Maya stood near the brass gate valve, her hands tucked into her overall pockets, her boots covered in dry clay. The reporter turned to her. "Maya, they say you built this using scrap metal Silas Vance threw away. Is that true? Did you really do the math yourself?" Maya blushed, shifting her weight from one boot to the other. She reached out and touched grandmother Opal's hand. Opal had been wheeled out to the edge of the field to watch, her eyes shining with pride. "The pipes were rusting in the grass," Maya said quietly. "We just cleaned them up and let gravity do the work. The math was all in my grandmother's book. We just followed the rules of the land." The following Thursday, the Callaway Sentinel published the story on the front page. The headline read, "Young Innovator Saves Family Farm with Scrap Metal and Gravity." The article detailed the step diameter design and the wool yarn plugs, praising the resourcefulness of the Pruitt family. Silas Vance sat in his office, looking at the newspaper, the front page photo of Maya standing proudly beside her green crops, staring back at him. Beside him, Brody stood in silence, looking out the window. The cornfields of Vance Agri were brown, dry, and ruined, a field of dry straw. The loss was total. That evening, a red pickup truck pulled up to the gate of Rollin Hills. Silas Vance got out. He was not wearing his alligator boots today. He wore simple dust-covered work shoes. He walked slowly up the dirt path toward the soybean field where Maya and Harlan were checking the line. Silas stopped at the edge of the crop. He looked at the steady green leaves, then at the silent steel pipes. The cobs of soybean plants were thick and full, promising a record yield. Silas reached down, plucked a pod, and split it open with his thumb. The beans inside were round, firm, and healthy. He looked at Maya. He took off his Stetson hat, holding it in his hands. It was a gesture of respect that Harlan had never seen from Silas. "Harlan," Silas said, his voice flat but quiet. "Maya, I came to say, I was wrong. I looked at those pipes and saw trash. I looked at you and saw a kid who didn't know how this valley worked. I was wrong. The valley belongs to those who know how to listen to it." He turned to Maya, extending his hand. His palm was calloused and rough, stained with dirt. Maya looked at his hand, then at her father. Harlan gave her a small, quiet nod. Maya stepped forward. Her own hand, wrapped in thin white medical tape over the raw blisters, met Silas's hand. They shook. "Nothing is truly worthless, Mr. Vance," Maya said, her voice steady. "It just depends on who is holding it." By the middle of September, the air in Callaway County smelled of wood smoke and dry leaves. The drought was over, but the victory for the Pruitt family was just beginning. The harvest at Rollin Hills was a triumph. The 15 acres of soybeans yielded a record harvest, bringing in $12,000 at the county elevator. With that money, Harlan paid the bank the full $8,500 loan payment with 20 days to spare. For the first time in 3 years, the mortgage paper sat secure in the steel drawer of Harlan's desk, and the threat of foreclosure was gone forever. Harlan could finally sleep very soundly at night, knowing the land his father had built would remain safe in the family. In the back room of the farmhouse, the yellowed manual from 1968 sat clean and open on Opal's desk. Beside it, the simple brass gate valve and the balanced gravity lines on the hill had become a local legend. Neighboring farmers regularly visited to study the design, marveling at how a teenager had solved an engineering problem that had stumped them all. Even Silas Vance sent 2 of his field hands to help Maya set up a similar system on his ridge, paying her a consulting fee of $1,500. But for Maya, the true reward wasn't the money or the front-page story. It was the simple, quiet knowledge that she had protected her family and kept their home secure. She had shown her brother Cass that dreams, when backed by hard work and intelligence, were worth fighting for. There are people like Maya in every small farming community. They don't have fancy engineering degrees or expensive commercial equipment, but they have the patience to look at what others throw away and see its value turning discarded scrap into a future. For Maya had proven to the entire county that nothing is truly worthless when it is placed in the intention of patience. This story of Maya Pruitt and the Roland Hills farm is more than just a tale of agricultural survival in a dry Kentucky summer. It is a profound testament to the power of human resourcefulness and the quiet strength of patience. When we look at Maya's journey, we are forced to ask ourselves a fundamental question about how we view the world around us. In our modern, fast-paced society, we have become accustomed to throwing things away the moment they show the slightest sign of wear or trouble. We discard old tools, we abandon difficult projects, and sometimes we even discard people and relationships when they become inconvenient or hard to manage. We live in a culture that values the shiny, the new, and the immediate. We praise Silas Vance's $5,000 high-powered pump because it represents power and instant results. But as this story shows, the most expensive machinery is often the most fragile when the real storms of life arrive. Consider the contrast between the 2 approaches to the drought in Callaway County. Silas Vance met the heat wave with raw force. He bought bigger pumps, he pulled more electricity, and he demanded more from the earth without giving anything back. He treated the land as a resource to be mined, and when his machines failed, he was left with nothing but dry stalks and a field of soot. Maya, on the other hand, approached the problem with humility and patience. She did not have the capital to buy her way out of the crisis, so she looked at what was already available. She saw value in the rusted steel pipes that Silas had thrown into the tall grass. She saw wisdom in an old manual from 1968 that had sat forgotten on a dusty shelf. She understood that the solution was not to fight the land with louder engines, but to work with the natural laws of gravity and flow. The rusted steel pipes in this story serve as a beautiful metaphor for the hidden resources in our own lives. How often do we look at our current circumstances and see only limitations? How often do we look at our own talents, our resources, or our relationships and think they are too damaged, too old, or too simple to be of any use? We tell ourselves that we need more money, more connections, or better equipment before we can start building our dreams. But Maya's example reminds us that the raw materials for our success are often already within our reach, disguised as worthless scrap. The key is not what we have, but how we choose to look at it. With patience, a rusted pipe can be cleaned. With labor, a worn thread can be cut new. With creativity, a ball of wool yarn can become a precision valve. Patience, however, is not a passive state. It is not simply waiting for the rain to fall or hoping that things will get better on their own. True patience is active, grinding work. It is Maya pushing a heavy wooden wheelbarrow with a cracked handle down a dusty road under a blazing 98-degree sun. It is her gritting her teeth and putting her entire body weight against a heavy iron die tool, turning it inch by inch until the rusted metal screams and gives way to clean silver threads. It is her father Harlan swinging a pickaxe in the dim moonlight after a full day of labor, silently standing by his daughter's side. This is the kind of patience that builds legacies. It is the willingness to do the quiet, unglamorous work that nobody else wants to do long after the spectators have finished their laughter and gone home to their air-conditioned porches. If you are facing your own season of drought right now, whether it is a financial struggle, a career setback, or a difficult personal challenge, let Maya's story be a source of deep encouragement for you. Do not let the laughter of the skeptics keep you from digging your trench. The people who doubt you are often the ones who rely on expensive, fragile systems that will fail them when the real heat arrives. They cannot see the natural flow of gravity on your hill. They can only see their own empty pumps. Keep your head down, hold on to your shovel, and trust the wisdom of those who came before you. Your current resources may look like nothing more than a pile of rusted metal in the grass, but in your hands, with time and determination, they can become the system that saves your future. As we close this chapter of the Rolling Hills Farm, we want to thank you for spending this time with us. It is our hope that these stories of quiet resilience remind you of the incredible strength that lies within ordinary families and communities. If you believe that determination, intelligence, and family are the true foundations of any community, please subscribe to watch our stories every week and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Share this story with someone who is struggling right now, someone who needs to be reminded that scrap can be turned into a future. And please tell us in the comments what this story means to you and where in the world you are watching from. We read every single comment, and we love hearing from our global family. Have a great day, stay strong, and we will see you next week.